There's a place He comes to me. Though I'm blind, He helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see Him face to face.
This is Kurt Kaikkonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Face to Face, we'll be in the book of Matthew. So grab your Bibles and let's get started. If you want to hear this complete message in its entirety, go to yourneighborhoodchurch.com, where you can download Your Neighborhood Church app at the App Store. But for most of us, we would have to be like this leprous man to come to Jesus, where we have no other hope after trying everything else. And so now Jesus, He sends him away, and He tells him not to tell anyone. He says, but go show yourself to the priest at the temple, and then to offer the appropriate offering that Moses commanded in the day of your cleansing. So now he goes off to the temple. But here is where you need to realize this is the first leper that Jesus ever cleansed. In fact, he's the first Jewish person that's ever cleansed from leprosy since the law was written, because Naaman, who Elisha cleansed, he wasn't a Jew. He was a Gentile. He was a Syrian. So now this leper, this Jewish leper, he shows up at the temple and he shows himself to the priest, because you had to show yourself to the priest for him to declare you clean. But that priest, he would have had to look up in the law of how to perform this specific offering, because it had never been done before. And even if it had been done for Miriam, for Moses' sister, it hadn't been performed for over 1,400 years. And so you can imagine this priest. He's never done this before, and he's never known anyone who has done this before. And then if you can remember way, way back when we were teaching in John, you remember that all these priests, well, they were all Sadducees. And Sadducees, they didn't believe in miracles. And so this guy, he's just the first of all these lepers that Jesus will be sending to the priest to testify to them that Jesus is the Messiah. And you kind of can get an idea of how this happened, because the same story of the leper that we just read, who was cleansed, we can read about him in the Gospel of Mark. And in Mark, we're told that he didn't obey Jesus. He didn't keep quiet, but he told everybody. And when he did this, he made it impossible for Jesus to go into the cities to minister. So people had to go outside the city to see Jesus. But because of this healing, all the lepers start coming to Jesus. And as often as they came, Jesus was cleansing them, and then he was sending them to the priests. And so you have this whole parade of cleansed lepers constantly flowing into the temple. And the priest, they were continually having to make the offering for a leper, this offering that they hadn't been performing for over 1,400 years. And what's really interesting is that when you read about the offering, and we won't read it, but we'll talk about it, but you can read that offering in Leviticus 14, and it consisted of 2 clean birds, some cedar wood, and some scarlet, and some hyssop. And so what would happen is they would take one of these birds, of the 2 birds, and it was to be killed, and it was to be killed over an earthen vessel. And that earthen vessel was to be held over running water. Okay, so that bird that's killed, well, in our minds as Christians, we'd say, well, that bird represented Jesus and his death. So that blood, it's collected in that earthen vessel. And earthen vessels were considered earthen vessels because earthen vessels are made of clay. We're made of clay. And so that represents Jesus becoming flesh and being held over the running water. Well, the running water, well, that's a type of the Holy Spirit. And then after you do this, you take that living bird, you take that second bird, and you dip that bird with some cedar wood and the scarlet and some hyssop, and you dip it in that earthen vessel of the blood of the sacrificed bird. And then what you do is you take that hyssop, which is a plant, which is like a sponge, and you sprinkle that 7 times on the leper, and then you pronounce him clean. But then what you do is you take the blood-covered bird, and then you let it go free and you let it fly away. And so what you have here is you have a picture of being set free by the blood of a substitute's sacrifice. And for us, that substitute is Jesus. And the thing is, it cleanses the leper from leprosy the same way as it cleanses the leprosy of our souls, because leprosy represents sin. And if I was going to take my very best guess, I would guess that Jesus' cross was made out of cedar wood. Okay, so now you have the priests. They're making this offering over and over and over for every leper that Jesus sends to them. And they should have known that this offering testifies of Jesus, especially when he was crucified. But they didn't. Somehow they missed it. Okay, so now Jesus, he leaves this leper and he's just about home and he just enters into Capernaum. And then a centurion comes up to him. And what a centurion is he's a Roman officer who's over 100 men. And every centurion that's ever mentioned in the Bible is an honorable man. And this centurion was no exception, because this centurion, he cared about his slave who had become paralyzed and he was in torment. So that he has a slave that's in pain and he's paralyzed. And as a Roman master, he had the right to kill his slave. And that's exactly what everybody expected him to do, because this would be like having a broken tool. This would be like your tractor, his engine seized up, so he's no good anymore. But instead, this Roman soldier, he cares about this slave, even though the slave is no use to him anymore. But instead of just accepting his loss and discarding him, he shows this love for him. And he pities him and he considers his life, because this slave, he's become like a part of the family to this Roman soldier. And we have to remember that there's just as many Gentiles up there in Capernaum as there was Jews in the Galilee area. And many of them were Romans, because if you remember, there's a Roman garrison that's outside of Nazareth. And then there's the Via Maris, which is the international trade route that ran through the Galilee. And even though that Jesus, he came to the Jews, all these Gentiles, they got to hear and they got to see Jesus too. And even though Jesus, he was on his way home, he was still willing to delay his homecoming to go to this non-Jewish Gentile Roman's house and to lay his hands on his slave to heal him. Now, most Jews, especially the religious Jews, well, they hated the Gentiles. And they especially hated the Romans, because it was the Romans who were oppressing Israel. But this Roman centurion, the Jews, they didn't hate him so much, because you'll read in Mark's gospel that this centurion, he's the one who built the Jews a synagogue. And if you went to Capernaum today, you would still see the stones from this actual synagogue that was built by this centurion. And so you figure this centurion, he probably lived somewhere in the area. He's not real far away. But a Jew, he would never enter a Gentile's house, because of Jewish tradition, because the Jews were taught that to enter a Gentile's house, that would make a Jew unclean. But this was never a part of God's law. It was just a part of the Jewish tradition. But Jesus, again, he's here and he's willing to go to this Gentile's house and to lay his hands on his slave and to heal him. And Jesus, he knew that he could heal that centurion servant from where he was. And he knew he could do it with just a word. But he wasn't aware that the centurion knew that Jesus had that type of authority to be able to heal his servant without him being physically present. So you can see that God has already been doing a great work in the centurion's heart, and how God has already revealed to him who Jesus really is and the kind of authority that Jesus really had. And he's basing it all on his own authority of what he's been taught. And so the centurion, he says that he doesn't need to come. In fact, he's not really even worthy for him to come into his house, under his roof. But that Jesus, he just needs to speak the word. And so it almost seems like the centurion is looking for a way to spare Jesus from being criticized from going into a Gentile's home. And he's also aware and trying not to inconvenience Jesus from taking up too much of his time. And this is one of the only 2 times where it says that Jesus marveled. And here it says, Jesus marveled at this man's great faith.
And he said that he didn't even see this kind of faith among any of the Jews. And the other time that Jesus marveled, he was actually talking about the Jews, because he marveled at their unbelief. And you can read that in Mark 6:6. And then Jesus states that many will come from the east and the west, and they'll sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so by Jesus saying this, he's clearing up a couple of misconceptions that the Jews had. One, there will be Gentiles in heaven. And the second, well, they'll be eating with us. And then the third is that heaven is made up of Jews and Gentiles. And then he also clears up that many of the sons of the kingdom, which is talking about the Jews, that they're not going to be there, that they're going to actually be going to hell. And that's because God's not racially biased at all. He sees all of us as one race. He sees us as the human race. We're all the race of Adam. And so then Jesus, he sends a centurion away, and he tells him that his request for his servant's healing will be done. And it was done, and it says it was done that very hour. So if this was all the very same day, we would see that Jesus, he finally made it home. But like I told you, this isn't the same day, because in Mark's gospel, we know that this next story, that it occurs on the Sabbath. So Peter's house, it's in Capernaum, and it's only a stone's throw away from that synagogue that we just talked about. And the archaeologists, they found what is believed to be Peter's house. And they've built this building over it, and they have a glass floor, and you can look and you can see all the ruins. And you would see that this house, it would have had a really lovely view of the lake. So Peter, he had a nice home. And so when Jesus, he walks into Peter's house, where he was probably staying, he finds Peter's wife's mother, and she's in bed with a fever. And so it's just a minor illness. And a Jewish rabbi, he wouldn't have even given it a second thought, because she's a woman. But Jesus, he comes and he touches her hand, because Jesus cares about even the smallest things that trouble us. Jesus doesn't just care about the big things like leprosy and paralysis. We can come to Jesus with the smallest requests. We can ask him for minor, small miracles, for healings, for just headaches, and for a fever. So Peter's mother-in-law, she gets up, she feels great, she's been healed, and then she begins to serve the Lord. And it's a really good thing. She probably got him some dinner, because after the dinner and when the sun sets, because you have to realize when the sun sets, the Sabbath is over, because the Sabbath, it started at sundown on Friday and it ended at sundown on Saturday. It usually ended when you could see 3 stars up in the sky. But see, on the Sabbath, you're only allowed to walk so far. It was called a Sabbath day journey. You're only allowed to go a little ways far from home, because that was a day of rest. And so now the sun's gone down, it's evening, but now all the people, it's a Saturday night, they have nothing better to do, so they're all going to go to Peter's house. Let's go to Peter's house. Let's go see Jesus. And so they do. They go to Peter's house and they bring everybody they know who's sick and everybody who's got a demon. They all bring them over to Peter's house. And so then they have this healing service.
You've been listening to Face to Face. Face to Face on this radio station has been provided by Your Neighborhood Church. If you want to help support Face to Face and put this program on other stations just like yours, you can contact us at yourneighborhoodchurch.com or write Your Neighborhood Church, P.O. Box 500, Romeo, Michigan 48065.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
Tune in again tomorrow at this same time as we continue to go through the Bible.